Vivian, the first Ether Anomaly agent in Zenless Zone 0, gracefully makes her appearance in the last patch before 2.0. Although perhaps gracefully is not the right word, be it in her flustered interactions with Phaethon, sometimes clumsy and stiff animation work, or just her savage damage numbers, it's clear that Vivian has a lot more going to her than meets the eye. Appearances can be deceiving, she says, and indeed, this is very much the case for Vivian herself. At first stern and aloof, she's actually quite selfless, and that's shown in the way her kit works, where you may sometimes benefit more from building Vivian's team over Vivian herself. On the surface, she may come across as an alternative to Burnice, an off-field damage dealer. But as it turns out, Vivian can be surprisingly effective at staying on field, and even pairs well with Burnice. And for a character that seems to be full of highly complex systems and convoluted skills, she can, in fact, be quite simple in play. As you can probably glean from the length of this guide though, such simplicity is in itself deceiving. Although Vivian turns out to be quite straightforward, the underlying mechanics that make up her character are not. And the more advanced your understanding is of these mechanics, the more value you can get from her. So let's break down Vivian's kit and the intricacies behind her moveset, and cover off the little things that will help you get the most out of her in combat. We can then go over the teams and comps that she has good synergies with, and those that she doesn't. After that, we'll go through her drive discs, stats, and engines, as well as her Mindscapes and how they can impact the way that she plays. Then, at the very end, close off with one more showcase of what she can do. We've got quite a few stops on this ride, so let's get this train rolling. Vivian revolves around trying to get as many Ablooms as possible. Most of Vivian's damage and a significant portion of her anomaly contribution come from it. To play Vivian well is to optimize around Abloom usage. So the first thing to do before we delve into the rest of her kit is to understand exactly what this is and how it works. Ablooms are a feature of Vivian's core passive, which will be triggered when basic attack Feather Bloom hits a target. Feather Bloom is the flower-like effect that you may see appear in enemies as you fight, which, as a result of her core passive, will often be accompanied by the Abloom text. It does respectable damage, 420% at level 11, but builds no daze, energy, or decibels. It does, however, build Anomaly, for a total of 126 Anomaly per hit. You may notice that Feather Bloom is not triggering any Ablooms here though, and this is because no attribute Anomaly has been applied to the target. As soon as an Anomaly is applied, the Abloom text and damage numbers will start to show. This case in particular comes from Vivian's additional ability. It will trigger Feather Bloom when another squad member applies an attribute Anomaly. It's important here to note that it's another squad member, not any squad member. If Vivian is the one to proc the Anomaly, the additional ability does not trigger Feather Bloom. If another squad member does though, even for Ether, or as an inactive character, then Feather Bloom will trigger, and by association, so will Abloom. What will apply to any squad member though is a standard Feather Bloom, which by default will trigger whenever an EX special hits an enemy. This can be other characters' EXs, or Vivian herself. They don't need to be the active character either. You can swap out mid-EX and they will still trigger, which makes inactive agents that can continuously use EXs, like Astra, incredibly useful. There is no internal cooldown for EX Ablooms, meaning that you can have multiple EXs and an Anomaly land at the same time and all of them will count. The description does say that there's a cooldown for Ablooms triggered off squad members' anomalies, but this seems to be either bugged or untrue, as Ablooms still trigger even if 2 anomalies are applied instantaneously. That's also true if they're spaced apart within 0.5 seconds, so for now at least, there's no cooldown. Ablooms aren't infinite though. At some point, you will run out of them. This is because every Abloom, be it from anomalies or EXs, need guard feathers. So let's break down what these are. Vivian has 2 unique resources that need to be maintained: guard feathers and flight feathers. Guard feathers attract via the 5 orbs underneath Vivian's portrait, specifically the outer circle. Flight feathers are instead the inner circle of the orbs, and you always begin with at least 2 of them stocked. Both have a cap of 5, but are not mutually exclusive. You can hold both guard feathers and flight feathers simultaneously. Guard feathers are the resources that are consumed whenever Feather Bloom is triggered. Since Ablooms are tied to Feather Bloom, the only way to get them is by spending guard feathers. If you hit multiple enemies with an EX, or have one skill proc anomaly on multiple targets at once, only one guard feather is consumed, but all enemies will be hit with Feather Bloom. So if you have 5 enemies and get both EX and attribute anomalies with the same move, that means only 2 guard feathers are used up, but 10 Abloom triggers happen, making Vivian pretty decent for bursting Shiyu mobs. Thing is, you can't get guard feathers directly. You must first build flight feathers and then convert them into guard feathers. Different attacks that Vivian performs will build a varying amount of flight feathers. You get 5 flight feathers from ultimate, 3 from EX special, 2 from chain attack, 2 from assist follow-up, and 1 from Noblewoman Waltz. For most moves, you don't actually need to land the attack to generate flight feathers. Unfortunately, you do need to land Waltz for its generation, so no free pre-stacking before fights. On the plus side, Waltz can be used as a counter. If you get it off, then you can get 2 flight feathers instead of 1. So even if it means waiting a little, it can be often worthwhile to slow down your rotation briefly to make sure you can get that extra feather. Once you've built some flight feathers, it's time to convert them, and you can do this by using Fluttering Frock Suspension. The Fluttering Frock state is when Vivian floats in the air. All of the same moves that generate flight feathers link directly into Fluttering Frock. She's fully invulnerable during this state. However, if you hold on for too long, Vivian will exit the state automatically. And you can get hit during the fall animation. You can cancel it manually by holding the dodge button, or even avoid going into it altogether by holding the dodge button after using an attack that would normally put Vivian into Fluttering Frock. There are some uses for this, but most of the time you won't want to be cancelling it. If you use the dodge button to exit Fluttering Frock, instead of letting it fall off naturally, you can still get perfect dodge. And you can EX special out of it with no penalty, as regardless of if you use it after cancel or after Fluttering Frock, it all takes the same amount of time. But you can't do standard basic attacks. For a good reason though. It's only from the Fluttering Frock state that Vivian gets access to the Suspension attack, a dive bomb that will convert all of your flight feathers to guard feathers. It's a 1-to-1 conversion rate, so 1 flight feather gets converted to 1 guard feather, 2 flight feathers into 2 guard feathers, and so on. You also don't need to hit any enemies with Suspension to generate feathers, just landing the dive is enough. Suspension can be executed by pressing basic attack in Fluttering Frock, but it's not recommended to activate it this way, because Vivian will cast it automatically when being swapped out of. You don't even need to wait to swap out after entering Fluttering Frock. You can swap on the very first frame of any attack that leads into it, and Vivian will still execute Suspension. As soon as you use Waltz or EX, you can swap out. And since that leads into Fluttering Frock, that means a guaranteed suspension if you're not on Vivian. And unlike most moves, which are unable to proc anomalies if they're not executed on the active character, the last hit of suspension is able to do so regardless if Vivian is or isn't the active character. Just because suspension can proc anomalies when Vivian isn't active, doesn't mean her other moves do. So to avoid overcapping, you may sometimes want to stay on Vivian for a bit, depending on how full the gauge is. And keep in mind that you can't swap to non-aftershock characters that are still on field. You must wait for all of their animations to end before they're available again. This isn't a problem though, as even with Vivian being on field, Ablooms can still be triggered. You can still swap into her mid-attack with a quick assist, but that's something to avoid as it interrupts suspension and so no feathers are converted. So be sure to wait until she lands before forcing quick assists. In fact, the time delay can be quite helpful. Since all flight feathers are converted at once, depending on your stacks, you might end up overcapping and wasting feathers. If you have 4 flight feathers and 2 guard feathers, converting them will use up all 4 of your flight feathers, but only top you up with 3 guard feathers, as they are all capped at 5. But if you can spend guard feathers before the final hit of suspension, then you aren't wasting any. To play Vivian well usually means not overcapping, so that you can maximize the number of Ablooms you can get in a fight. And one of the best ways to maximize Ablooms is through the Noblewoman state. The Noblewoman state is when Vivian poses with her parasol open and spinning behind her. Like Fluttering Frock, it will end automatically after a short while. When entering the stance, Vivian gains a stack of auto dodge, which lasts only for as long as you remain in it. You know you have an auto dodge stack based on whether her parasol is glowing or not. And since you lose it when exiting the stance, this means it doesn't carry over to other moves. And that also means that it's functionally capped at 1, so you can't stack it. Despite it being a dodge, you get no perfect dodge bonuses from it. Really though, you don't want to be relying on this dodge, as if you're going to get hit, you're better off just using Waltz. It's only from Noblewoman stance that Vivian is able to use the Noblewoman Waltz attack. As we've covered before, it grants 1 flight feather normally, or 2 if you get its perfect dodge effect. As all the other methods to acquire flight feathers require resources, be it energy, assist points, decibels, or ways of forcing chain attacks, Waltz will likely be your primary way to gain flight feathers for Vivian. And since it leads into Fluttering Frock, it will also be the primary way to convert them to guard feathers via suspension. There's quite a few ways of entering the Noblewoman state, and therefore gaining access to Waltz. One of which is done by idling. But in combat this isn't really a viable option. Another way of entering the Noblewoman state is through quick assists. This is especially useful for some comps, like Astra, which provide on-demand quick assists and therefore easy access to Waltz and feather generation. Still, keep in mind that Noblewoman state is not Noblewoman Waltz. If you quick assist but immediately swap out, Vivian won't perform Waltz, as quick assist will only place her in the Noblewoman state. Noblewoman Waltz is the attack that comes after entering Noblewoman state, so don't be too hasty and use it before swapping. Dodge counters can also lead into Noblewoman state, allowing for easy access even without quick assists against aggressive enemies. Like quick assists, this only puts Vivian in the Noblewoman state, so if you try and dodge assist tech out of Vivian, you will get the dodge counter but no Waltz after. Although, if you're already in the Noblewoman state, you can dodge assist tech out of Waltz and still get the feather bonus. And you can also dodge assist tech into Vivian. With the decibel and feather generation her defensive assists and follow-ups provide, this is something you want to be doing. You can even do this on red flashes, as they lead to dodge counters, which means Noblewoman state and Waltz. Depending on the fight, it can set you up into a Waltz counter right after, maximizing your feather generation. Considering you do get it via quick assists though, the tried and true get hit tech works as well. You can also enter Noblewoman straight out of an EX special. Holding dodge as it transitions into Fluttering Frock puts you into the Noblewoman state. I did say that there were some uses for casting out of Fluttering Frock, and this is one of them. You could use an EX special and then go straight into a Waltz counter to immediately cap out your flight feathers. Or you could quick assist into Waltz, then use an EX special right after and make use of the EX cancel to Noblewoman for another Waltz, which would give you a full 5 feathers against passive enemies. The final way of entering Noblewoman state is after Vivian's basic 4. Since, by default, Vivian only starts with flight feathers, this can be a pretty handy way of going straight into Fluttering Frock for Shiyu or Deadly Assault openers. Outside of the opener though, it's not a particularly efficient way of getting into Noblewoman state. Basics 1 through to 3 deal physical damage, not ether, so you're spending a lot of time with very little anomaly buildup. But if you can shortcut to the later basics, then it can be surprisingly useful. Since Vivian's EX special costs 60 energy, she will often be energy starved and can struggle in generating enough feathers. This is where Vivian's regular special comes in handy, as it shortcuts straight into basic 3. Depending on how you activate your quick assist, it isn't that much slower. And although the special doesn't generate any energy, the basic 3 and basic 4 do. A quick assist into Waltz will give you around 69.1 anomaly buildup and 2.8 energy. But the special shortcut strength is over 161.7 anomaly buildup and 8 energy, well over double the anomaly and almost 3 times more energy than the quick assist strength. There is one more shortcut with dash attack, which goes to basic 2 instead of basic 3. But given that basic 2 builds no anomaly, and most of the anomaly and energy buildup is backloaded into basic 4, it's not as worthwhile as a special shortcut. I don't want to oversell this. Quick assists can be a lot faster depending on how they're activated. And although assist follow-ups aren't providing any energy, the 2 flight feathers and absurd amount of decibels Vivian generates more than make up for it. But making use of the string allows for Vivian to be on field while contributing anomaly and refilling her energy, all the while also entering Noblewoman state to gain access to both Waltz and Fluttering Frock. This is a big deal for some comps, like Burnice, who doesn't have many effective on-field routes. Even with characters that want to on-field, like Miyabi or Yanagi, Vivian can sometimes struggle on applying enough anomaly to juggle disorders without the assistance of her Wenjin, M2, or Deadly Assault buffs. So the special shortcut can be an effective way to push for extra buildup, or as a way to gain more energy to sustain EX special casts. And EX specials are important, specifically due to their high feather generation. It's feathers and Ablooms that drive Vivian's damage after all. So now you should have an understanding of what Abloom is, as well as what flight and guard feathers are, and the various methods Vivian has to get them. But how do we actually trigger Ablooms? EX specials, or attribute anomalies from agents that are not Vivian, yes, but it's a little bit more complex than just that. If we use Jane's EX special, we get an Abloom proc at the very end. With Lycon, even if we spend the energy on his extension, we also get only one Abloom on the final hit. Burnice, though, gets 2 on both her first and second EX casts. And unlike the others, she gets Abloom to trigger at the very start of her EX rather than at the end. Try it with Evelyn, and no matter how many times you loop her EX, Abloom just refuses to trigger. For this, we need to establish the concept of the finishing attack, or finisher for short. You may have noticed how, sometimes, the enemy is at max days, or has their anomaly gauge full, or has no health left. But no matter how many times you hit them, they don't get stunned, Anomaly never takes over, and they just don't die. Do another attack though, and suddenly it all works again. This is very obvious with ultimates, with most not stunning, proccing Anomaly, or killing enemies until their very final hit. We call this last hit finishing attack, or finishers for short. Jane's basic one is a one-hit attack, and it's a finisher. Jane's enhanced dash attack though only has a finisher on the very last damage tick of the very last hit. The same is true for Lycon's EX. Burnice though has it on every single hit of her EX, be it at the start, the middle, or the end. Vivian's Ablooms are looking for this tag. If it's an EX special and a finisher, it will proc an Abloom. Evelyn can get Ablooms, but only if she detonates her binding seal, as that is the portion of her EX that's a finisher. And while finishers don't work for anomaly application or kills if you swap out of the active character before they land, the Featherbloom proc doesn't care about this and works even for inactive characters. There is something weird though. And if you look into the description for Featherbloom, it specifies it can only trigger once per EX. We've seen that Burnice can get it twice with her EX. The same is true for Piper, who gets it both during her spin and with her really heavy extension. And that's because the game is actually looking for each instance of an EX special. Sokaku can keep looping her EX over and over, and every hit will trigger a bloom. You may think this has to do with how it's presented in-game. Burnice has 2 separate descriptions for her EXs, Heat Stirring Method and Double Shot. Same for Piper, with Engine Spin and Really Heavy. Sokaku doesn't, but as she's just recasting the same move over and over, it's technically a new instance every time. Unfortunately, it's not that straightforward. Lyra only has 1 entry for his EX, but despite having a follow-up like Lycon, it actually procs on both hits. Naturally, you may think this is because if you extend Lycon's EX, his finisher is postponed until the final hit, so of course he'd only get it once. And you'd be right. But it all rides on how the game labels EX moves. Ben and Corrin both have finishers on their last hits. They only get 1 Abloom proc though, as despite the extensions, it's still part of the same move. This is actually the same way that it works with Burnice. She can use and hold her EX, refresh it multiple times, and then go into the final explosion, but it will all trigger only 1 Abloom if you don't go into double shot. It may seem inconsistent, and it is, but with this information we can test a few theories. If you begin spinning with Piper, she'll take a short while to get an Abloom. This is because Piper's EX only activates when her regular special reaches its maximum charge level. If you combo her special after her dodge counter, dash attack, or basic 3, she can go immediately into her EX, and since like Burnice, all of its hits are finishers, you get an instant Abloom. Since Featherbloom only cares for each instance of an EX, and Piper's really heavy extension only triggers when she has no more energy or when her spin is at maximum charge, this means we can skip Piper's really heavy and constantly chain dash attacks into EXs to loop Ablooms over and over with a net neutral energy spend. Or maybe just go into an early really heavy and swap out of Piper into Vivian midway through, making for a really smooth rotation that both spends and generates feathers. Given the way Ablooms are triggered, that works very well with certain Mindscapes. Yanagi's M2 allows her to loop the thrust portion of her EX. Since each thrust is a finisher, and we're functionally recasting the EX, that means each and every thrust procs an Abloom, making for one of the most overpowered combinations in this game. There are other Mindscapes that work very well with Vivian's Abloom mechanic, but for that, we need to understand how its damage works. If you look at Vivian's core passive, the values it can give seem quite odd. Fire gets 8% damage scaling per 10 points of anomaly proficiency, whereas physical is only 0.75%. Yet it turns out that physical scales a lot more than burn does for Vivian. The first thing to clarify is that although Vivian's core passive specifies that it is every 10 points of anomaly proficiency, it's okay to have values that are not in multiples of 10, as the reality is that every single point counts. Another important clarification is that Abloom by itself does no damage. Instead, it inherits the damage from the current attribute anomaly inflicted on the enemy target. This isn't just the element of the anomaly, although it does that too. You may notice the color of the Abloom damage number changes depending on the anomaly it's triggered from. But by inheriting the damage, I mean that your Vivian can be built to the gills with max level discs, signature engine, the whole lot. But if the anomaly that's inflicted on the target is weak, then Abloom will be too. In fact, no amount of attack percent or damage percent bonuses will increase the damage from Abloom. The only stat that matters is anomaly proficiency, nothing else. With no engine and having only a single anomaly proficiency drive disc, having only Seth's shield as a buff for Vivian, Abloom is going to be hitting for just over 40,000 damage. With all other things being equal, if instead you are fully geared out with as much attack and damage percent as possible, but don't have anomaly proficiency stats or buffs, then when you go on to trigger Abloom, you only hit for around 16,000 damage. So to understand how Abloom's damage works, we need to understand how anomaly damage works. Looking at the formula, different types of anomaly have different base damage multipliers associated with them. Take burn for example. Its base damage is 50% times attack. So if we use an example value of 100, that means each burn tick would hit for 5,000 damage. Since it hits once every 0.5 seconds and it lasts 10 seconds, that means 20 ticks, so a total potential damage of 100,000. If we look at corruption, its base damage is 62.5 times attack. With the same value of 100, that means each tick would hit for 6,250 damage. It can also hit every 0.5 seconds, and it also lasts 10 seconds. So they have a total potential damage value of 125,000. If we break down the values for all anomalies, we're left with this list. From a glance, it looks like corruption and shock are the strongest anomalies. But this is where Vivian's multipliers and Vivian's prophecy becomes important. Assault and shatter have the lowest total potential damage for anomalies, but they also have the lowest percent values in Vivian's core passive. This is because the damage that Abloom is derived from isn't the total potential damage of the anomaly, but from the damage that each individual tick actually does. Instead of looking at the number after all ticks are factored in, we need to be looking at the damage of a single hit instead. Burn has the highest multiplier at 8%, but this is also because it has the weakest damage ticks out of all the anomalies. They do come fast, but each individual hit is weak, and this is what Abloom scales from. Assault, on the other hand, has the highest single hit of damage, but it only ticks once. Since Abloom would scale off this hit, it has the lowest multiplier at 0.75%. So if we bring up our list again, it looks like corruption is tied for the strongest, and shatter is the weakest. But if we instead look at the individual single hit of damage, then assault would be the strongest and burn would be the weakest. But if we now make use of multipliers in Vivian's core passive, the order flips on its head. Shatter is the strongest and corruption is the weakest. This list is still not quite accurate though, because there are other factors that we need to consider. Vivian's additional ability increases both corruption damage and corruption disorder damage by 12%. So if we factor this into our new list, corruption is now third place, with burn and shock tied for last. It's these values that are ultimately used to calculate the Abloom damage. We can test this live too. Vivian has 118 anomaly proficiency. All other stats are irrelevant. When we proc Assault of Piper, we do 142,244 assault damage and 12,589 Abloom damage. If we times the damage dealt by the multiplier on Vivian's core passive, we get the same number in our calcs that we do in the game. Now, let's give Vivian an anomaly proficiency drive disc and try the exact same test again, this time with 210 anomaly proficiency. Just like before, we'll proc Assault of Piper. still doing 142,244 damage. But this time, Abloom hits for 22,404 damage. If we do the math again and just replace the number for Anomaly proficiency, it lines up as expected when rounded up. Now the exact same Vivian with the exact same Anomaly proficiency, but instead of triggering Assault with a level 60 Piper, we'll do so with a gearless level 10 Corrin. Now that we're only doing 1,091 Assault damage, our Abloom is only hitting for 172 damage. This time, instead of replacing the Anomaly proficiency bit of the equation, we're replacing the source Anomaly damage. And just like before, the numbers add up. At the start, I mentioned how you may sometimes benefit more from building Vivian's team over Vivian herself. And this is precisely the reason why. The stronger the Anomaly that Abloom is triggered from, the more damage it will do. All that Vivian's Abloom does is scale off the original Anomaly's damage based off her core passives rate and her Anomaly proficiency stat. It doesn't matter how much attack percent or damage percent Vivian has, none of that gets transferred to Abloom. All of its damage comes from the original Anomaly. Although Abloom itself may only scale with Anomaly proficiency, your other stats still influence its source Anomaly damage. Even for Vivian, if you happen to trigger Abloom and Corruption applied by her. Attack percent, pen percent, damage percent, Anomaly proficiency, there's a lot of stats that go into determining the final Anomaly damage. Like with the normal damage formula, the more diversified your stats, the more damage you'll do. 100 multiplied by 2.5 gets you 250. But when spread across 3 stats at 1.5 instead, you're at 337.5. The same logic applies to Anomaly damage. Since Vivian wants as much Anomaly proficiency as possible, that means she'll likely have lower attack percent. And outside of her drive discs and sets, she has no regular damage percent bonuses. Even her signature only increases Anomaly proficiency when it comes to damaging stats. So triggering Ablooms on Ether that Vivian built is usually going to be worse than on Anomalies built by another unit, even if they may not be as well built. This does indirectly help with simpler hypercarry playstyles. You can sit on Jane and just apply assaults back to back, over and over, and in theory, you'd be getting the most Abloom damage possible. If you're playing optimally though, you should still shoot for disorders, even with assaults. And it's not like sitting in Ether Anomaly is a bad thing with Vivian. Whenever Vivian lands Suspension or Feather Bloom, and does so on a target that is inflicted with an attribute anomaly, a damage over time effect will be applied that takes every 0.55 seconds. This will last for as long as the target has an anomaly on them, which for anomaly teams means almost the whole fight. It's also just regular damage, completely unrelated to anomalies and Abloom, which means that it can also crit. 55% damage every 0.55 seconds can add up over the course of a long fight, like Deadly Assault. But you aren't building Vivian for crit damage, and it pale in comparison to the total damage from Ablooms. Its actual damage value is inconsequential. What we care about is its tick rate. Remember how Burn and Corruption both get 20 ticks, once every 0.5 seconds, but Corruption has a higher damage modifier than Burn? This is because some anomalies, namely Corruption and Shock, are conditional anomalies. They only tick for damage if you hit the enemy. Burn ticks every 0.5 seconds guaranteed, whereas Corruption has a cooldown of 0.5 seconds. Since it's unlikely every hit will be frame perfect, that means that your ticks will drift, and you rarely, if ever, get the full damage value out of Corruption. If you're in a fight and get stuck in a defensive assist or have delays between your attacks, that's time Corruption and Shock aren't doing anything. Vivian's Prophecy, though, takes every 0.55 seconds. As it's considered regular attack damage, that means it can proc both Corruption and Shock. It's 0.55 seconds, not 0.5, but that's close, and over the course of a fight, the extra ticks definitely add up. So, Corruption and Shock may be on the low end when it comes to Vivian's Abloom scaling, but that's made up by them having a higher base damage that Vivian's Prophecy helps guarantee. Not to mention they're much higher on the Disorder pecking order, getting you numbers you just can't get from the other elements. Vivian's Corruption Disorder bonus from her additional ability helps with this too. It should be noted that it applies only to Corruption Disorders, not any other type. Disorders damage numbers may be white, but they do inherit the element of their parent anomaly. Corruption Disorder is not the same as Shock Disorder. That means you get a damage bonus when applying another anomaly that replaces Corruption. If we use Ambi's EX to proc Shock after Vivian inflicts Corruption without her additional ability, we get 34,734. Now if we do the exact same setup with the exact same timing, we instead get 38,902, exactly 12% more than the previous test. If we try this in reverse though, such as with Vivian's Featherbloom proccing corruption out of NB shock, regardless of additional ability, the damage is always the same. It's also important to point out that the damage formula document I reference is right, but can be a bit confusing. When looking at the document, you may see that both the anomaly damage formula and the disorder damage formula are exactly the same. And that's because they are. But they do have different values that are being used for the base damage portion. For a regular shock anomaly tick, that's just 125% times attack. For shock disorder though, it's 450% plus the number of seconds times 125%, and then have that times attack. It's still the same formula, but the way that the base damage is derived will change slightly. The same is true for the anomaly damage percent multiplier in this formula. If Vivian's additional ability grants her both 12% corruption damage and 12% corruption disorder damage, you may think that adds up to 24% total on the disorder. The only place they can slot into is the anomaly damage percent multiplier after all. But that's not the case. The formula is right. It is the same multiplier. But just like ice damage percent is not the same as fire damage percent, corruption damage percent and corruption disorder damage percent are also different. Grace gets up to 36% shock damage increase with her additional ability. But whether you have it active or not, her shock disorder damage is still the same. That's because shock damage is not shock disorder damage. Lighter can increase ice and fire damage by up to 75% to the whole team. Both of them are damage percent increases, both of them slot in the same part of the equation. But because they deal with different elements, they're not stacking with each other. You're not getting 150 damage percent, only 75%. Disorder is kind of like that. Corruption damage is not the same as corruption disorder damage, even though they slot in the same part of the equation. So you may not be getting 24% to Vivian's disorders, but it does mean a diversified 12% increase to both corruption damage, which will buff Ablooms if they land during ether, and also a 12% increase to corruption disorder damage. But there's another significant separation between anomaly application and disorders. Or rather, anomaly application and any form of anomaly damage, like regular corruption. What I'm referring to is snapshotting. When building anomaly, what skill you use is mostly irrelevant. You can build all of the anomaly bar with an ultimate, or do so with the basic attacks. You're going to be getting the same anomaly damage ticks and the same disorder damage. There are exceptions to this though. Take, for example, Miyabi's additional ability. It increases her enhanced basic attack damage by 60%. If you do the exact same rotation with the same gear, the shatter damage from the one that had the additional ability active will hit harder. This is because the damage percent bonus from her additional ability was snapshotted. Buffs and debuffs in Zenless Zone 0 have two broad categories, player-sided and enemy-sided. This looks simple at first. A player-sided bonus is something like Lighter's Elation. You hit the enemy, you build stacks, and it applies to your characters. There's even a buff icon. No matter what you hit or who you hit, that extra bonus is carried over across all enemies. Your damage only decreases when the buff runs out. An enemy-sided bonus is something like Nicole's Death Shred. Rather than a buff icon, it's a debuff icon, and it applies only to that enemy. Apply her Death Shred to an enemy, and you hit harder. But as soon as they're gone, you aren't getting any bonuses. Except that starts getting a little complicated. Some bonuses are invisible. The buffs you get from the Astra Voice Disk Drive set don't have any buff icons, and they don't even show up on your stat sheet, but they are there as player-sided buffs. Miyabi's additional ability is giving her 60% damage bonus, but there's no indicator of that in a fight other than your damage numbers. Regardless of what is visible or not, Anomaly application will look at your current stats and snapshot them. If we build all of the Anomaly gauge without Caesar Shield buff, but then apply just before we proc Assault, we're going to be doing 7,593 damage. No different than if no shield was used, because all of the Anomaly gauge was filled without the buffs being on. On the flip side, if I build the Anomaly gauge with the shield buff, then have the shield fall off before I proc Assault, I get a much higher damage value as the buffs were active while I was building the Anomaly gauge. So if I then build around half of the Anomaly gauge without the shield buff, and the other half with, my total assault damage is going to be an average of that. This snapshotting only cares about the player-sided buffs that were active when the anomaly was being built. If you apply Nicole's Death Shred and build up all of the anomaly gauge while it's on, but then it falls off just before you get your anomaly damage off, it will completely ignore it. No snapshotting here. But if you build all of the physical anomaly gauge without the Death Shred, then apply it so that your assault lands while it's on, then the full 100% of your damage will benefit from it. Although anomaly application snapshots your stats as you build them, the anomaly damage instance doesn't. It's the opposite. It only cares about enemy-sided debuffs. You could build all of your anomaly in stun, but if the damage instance happens just as it wears off, you get no damage bonus. But build the entire gauge outside of stun, and so long as the damage occurs during stun, it will all benefit from the multiplier. This is because it's the anomaly application that cares about player-sided buffs, not disorder or the anomaly damage ticks. This is both good and bad. For anomalies that only hit once, like Shatter or Assault, this means you can take your sweet time building that gauge, then load up all of your enemy-sided debuffs just before the damage happens. For anomalies with multiple hits though, like Burn, even if you apply an enemy-sided debuff, unless you can maintain that and keep reapplying it for every tick, it's going to fall off. And this can make for awkward situations. Arena's 10% buffs are applied to a character, so they're player-sided. That means you want it to be active during your anomaly application and don't particularly care if it's up for your damage ticks. But Nicole's Death Shred is applied to the enemy, making it enemy-sided. So you don't care for it during your anomaly application, but absolutely want it to be up when the damage ticks. Normally, Abloom is just going to be a percentage of the original anomaly damage. Whether it's the first or second Abloom proc from Piper's EX, both hits here are doing 587. Like any other form of anomaly damage though, its damage isn't snapshotted, meaning you need to have debuffs applied for when the damage lands. If we now apply Nicole's debuff, the first Abloom hits for 747, but the second goes back to 587 as the debuff runs out. So even if the original anomaly damage instance happened while the enemy was debuffed, if it falls off before Abloom is triggered, then it won't benefit from that bonus. Every hit, be it the original anomaly ticks or Abloom itself, only checks for the debuffs when it is triggered. This isn't a problem for some characters, like Astra with her M1. The Red Shred is enemy-sided, but as it lasts for 30 seconds, it's not a problem. Unfortunately, the same cannot be said for Nicole. Usually, she's one of the best supports for any team. Nicole has some of the highest damage buffs in the game, has a really good anomaly buildup, both chains and ultimates hit hard and come out fast, and not to mention that as a support, she has great range and options to help. In fact, when looked at in isolation, she's the second most effective buffer in the game for Ether agents, barely behind Astra. With Vivian being an Ether agent, this seems like it'd be a match made in heaven. But as it turns out, almost all of Nicole's functions fall short in Vivian teams. Nicole's damage buffs are great, yes, but impossible to maintain for Vivian. Since Ablooms need Nicole's Death Shred to be applied during the moment they take for damage, that means you need the debuff up for all Ablooms to get full value. As it only lasts for 3.5 seconds, the window is quite tight. This is very cumbersome, but not impossible. Since you can apply this with a dash attack, it's just a matter of swapping to Nicole before using EX specials or prior to your anomaly procs. But something's weird here. With Nicole's debuff, in our test environment, Abloom should be hitting for 747. This rotation though has them take for 791. What's going on here? The difference is that for the first test, we only applied Nicole's additional ability after the corruption procced. Whereas in the second, we did it before the anomaly gauge was full. This doesn't line up. If anomaly application doesn't care about enemy-sided effects, and only the anomaly damage instance does, then why is the damage higher? You see, Nicole's benefits are not just her Death Shred, but her additional ability and Wenjin effects. Nicole's additional ability says that it lets all squad members deal 25% more ether damage to the target for 3.5 seconds. You might think that this is an enemy-sided debuff. After all, it's only being applied to an enemy target. But this is not the case. The way this buff works is more like, when the target is hit, treat the ether damage percent of the move as being 25% higher. To us, it functions like an enemy-sided debuff. The same attack hitting two targets will only deal increased damage to the one with a debuff. But as far as anomaly application is concerned, damage percent increases like this are player-sided, not enemy-sided. The same is true for her signature wenchant, the Vault, with its 24% damage buff being a debuff that in actuality buffs characters when they hit a target. We've established that debuffs don't matter for the build-up, so I can apply Nicole's debuff, build gauge, and it do the same damage. Unlike the Death Shred though, the Vault only works on EX specials, chain attacks, and ultimates, not basics or dash attacks. So if I use Nicole's EX and then build Anomaly with Piper, then wait for the buff to fall off, you'd think it wouldn't impact my damage as it's all enemy sided. But because Piper had damage percent buffs from the Vault during her build-up, as they're actually player sided, it carries over to the final damage, even though it all falls off before Assault procs. So be wary about trusting the in-game descriptions, as something can look like it's enemy sided, but it's actually player sided. For reference, as of 1.7, you can consider all bonuses other than Resistance Shred, Defense Shred, and Stun multipliers to be player-sided. So to get the full bonus out of Nicole, you need to have her buffs up for your Anomaly application, but also have the Death Shred up for the Anomaly damage instance. This conflict between player-sided buffs and enemy-sided debuffs means Nicole's bonuses are incredibly difficult to keep up. To get Nicole's full value, you need to have her damage percent bonuses applied for all of your agent's Anomaly application, and then have the Death Shred applied for every single Anomaly damage instance and the Ablooms as well. Even if you could play this game with a tool assist, the energy requirements to sustain Nicole's constant EX specials would be a limiting factor. And then there's her Anomaly build-up rate. This is usually a strength for Nicole, and it could help make up for Vivian's lack of build-up bonuses. But if you recall, Anomaly application is averaged. Assuming the characters are built, even if you benefit in full from Nicole's additional ability and the Vault's damage percent buff during your Anomaly application, corruption damage is still likely going to be lower than if you were just doing it without any buffs with Vivian. We call this Anomaly dilution, which is when a character with a lower Anomaly proficiency lowers the total Anomaly damage as a result of their build-up. So although Nicole can work, her damage buffs are truly absurd after all. The combination of strict swap and debuff timing for her attacks, unfeasibility of maintaining both constant buff and debuff application, as well as her Anomaly dilution, means that she isn't a great partner for Vivian. Another character that surprisingly doesn't synergize particularly well with Vivian is Miyabi. Since Miyabi is a crit scaling character, even after factoring in the excessive amounts of damage percent bonuses that she gets from her moves, her low Anomaly proficiency means that her shatter damage isn't going to be particularly high. With the right setup, a Frostburn break can hit hard, very much so. But that's a function of Miyabi's core passive, separate from the Frost Anomaly. And although Frost Zorda has a higher base percent damage multiplier than standard Ice Anomaly, Abloom only cares about the Anomaly damage, which means shatter damage, and that's not going to be anywhere near as high. So when pairing Miyabi and Vivian together, Vivian's damage does take a hit. Depending on the situation, it may be better to proc Ablooms off the Ether Anomaly that Vivian inflicts, as it could very well scale better than Miyabi's Ice Anomaly. But despite all of this, Miyabi-Vivian teams are still some of the strongest in the game. She's the prime example that just because something doesn't synergize well, doesn't mean that it's bad. Vivian is an Anomaly character after all, and she can help Miyabi with the Zordas, while contributing decent damage. You might think that if Miyabi's Anomalies aren't good, then why not run Miyabi, Vivian, and another character who could maximize Anomaly damage? Why not run a triple Anomaly team? This could mean constant disorders without needing to be reliant on Vivian's Anomaly application. With Vivian's additional ability, that also means constant Ablooms from continuous attribute anomalies being applied. But that doesn't work either. If Ablooms scale off its parent Anomaly, you want it to be as strong as possible. That means pumping as many buffs as you can to the character applying it. And as it turns out, more Anomaly units doesn't necessarily mean more disorders or more Anomaly buildup. All Anomalies have a 3-second internal cooldown in their application. After inflicting burn, for example, it doesn't matter if the Anomaly gauge is full. No finisher is going to proc it again until 3 seconds have passed. This cooldown though applies to disorders as well, creating a universal Anomaly application cap. If I build 3 different Anomalies, Fire, Frost, and Electro, I can apply Burn, then immediately proc a disorder with Frost. If I try another disorder or shock though, I'm locked out of doing so for 3 seconds. Disorder itself has a 3-second internal cooldown, and since you need to apply an anomaly to trigger it, the game will not allow you to do so until the cooldown expires. So in practice, a triple anomaly team is not only doing less damage than a standard double anomaly, it's not even getting more disorders, as anomalies are held at 100% gauge while waiting for the cooldown, leading to a wasted anomaly generation. There's a few more anti-synergies for Vivian. Caesar's buff, for example, only applies on the active character. This isn't that bad, as Vivian's Ablooms don't care for Caesar's shield, so as long as you keep it on your main carry during anomaly application, it can work out. But Vivian inflicts a lot of anomaly off-field with Feather Bloom and swap outs, so the damage on them, and consequently the disorders from corruption, would be impacted. Although, considering Caesar's EX extension counts for triggering Ablooms, it still makes for a good pairing, as Caesar can help with spending feathers. You do want to feed Vivian with defensive assists where possible, or anomaly and feathers, but Caesar only uses one assist point on her defensive assist. And you can't assist the Vivian while she does suspension, so alternating between the two is a solid strategy. Pokra is so-so, as she also relies on defensive assists for her stacks, and unlike Caesar, uses 2 assist points. But she provides a quick assist, and Vivian's special shortcut is an accessible way to trigger Pokra's aftershocks, meaning you get 2 feathers total anyways, so it can kind of work. If at M6, her buff should have uptime to cover all anomaly application, making her an alright pairing. Attackers on the other hand just won't work well. Vivian always wants to run with another anomaly unit because she wants strong, diversified anomaly damage on the enemy. You can run a full fun Harumasa Vivian comp, but just like Grace, it's not going to be particularly strong. That hasn't stopped people from getting over 50,000 scores with it in Deadly Assault though, so if you're willing to put in the work, it can work. Technically, you can run a hypercarry Vivian team. The same logic that's used in a hypercarry Yanagi team can work here. Just keep triggering Ablooms over and over for constant nukes and corruption. More on-field Vivian means more Waltz, which usually means more feathers, and that means more Ablooms. Although, since Vivian can't proc Ablooms by inflicting Anomaly, that makes you very dependent on EX specials for them. So unlike Yanagi, Vivian has a lot less flexibility here, as Astra would almost always be a necessity. But Astra is more than just a way to play hypercarry comps. She's just an absolute powerhouse of a unit, and by far and away the best character for Vivian in general. There is no such thing as a mandatory team, but the benefits that Astra confers to Vivian are so great that between running Astra on an Evelyn team or on a Vivian team, I'd be more inclined to run her with Vivian. Every precise assist triggered when Astra has energy leads to an EX special. And since these can trigger Abloom even from an inactive state, this means you can get Ablooms over and over, almost every time you swap characters in the team. Vivian's additional ability won't work if she's the one to proc Ether, but Astra can do that, which means you sometimes trigger 2 Ablooms with just 1 swap. So rid yourself of any concerns you might have about being able to spend Vivian's guard feathers on time. Naturally, you can only spend them as quickly as you gain them, and Vivian can struggle with generating flight feathers if there aren't many opportunities to use her assist follow-up or dodge counter. But Astra can provide quick assists for free. Even without energy, Astra will automatically cast her regular special when swapped to and trigger a quick assist prompt, meaning easy access to Noblewoman state and Waltz. Don't forget that Astra's ultimate leads to free chains. If you exit the idyllic cadenza state before the first swap, then you can even get 2 chains in Vivian for 4 flight feathers, in addition to the suspension follow-up to convert them. And unlike Nicole, Astra's buffs last a very long time. Even her enemy-sided debuffs, like from M1, have long durations. And also unlike Nicole, Astra's anomaly generation is very low. So although there will be some dilution, it is not much, and would be more than made up by the buffs that Astra provides. And said buffs see very little saturation, as Vivian has no inherent attack or damage percent bonuses, so it scales particularly well with her. It genuinely doesn't get better than Astra. There are other good supporting agents though. Seth provides up to 100 anomaly proficiency, which can help boost Vivian's Abloom damage even further. Or alternatively, increase the anomaly proficiency of your other anomaly agent, as Abloom would scale off that too when it triggers outside of Ether. And to make things even better, the Anomaly build-up resistance shred from his additional ability is applied to all attributes, which can really help with Vivian's Anomaly application woes depending on your level of investment. Sokaku is good too if you're running a Miyabi team, not just for her buffs, but also due to her having an easy way to trigger Ablooms through her EX loops. Which is in part the reason why Burnice also works so well with Vivian. Being able to proc Ablooms on demand as a result of her 2-part EX can make for some very strong burst. With the right cancels, you can use up all 5 guard feathers in the time that it takes Vivian to do 1 suspension. It can feel a bit awkward with Burnice at first, but if you make use of the special shortcut into basic 3, it gets a little better. Piper is also great at triggering Ablooms, but unlike Burnice, it doesn't need Vivian to be the active character all that often. And as we've covered before, can allow you for swaps midway through her EX to give Vivian time to build feathers, so you're getting them as you spend them. Fast feather spend isn't as big of a deal if you have Astra on the team though, as she can easily sustain Vivian's Abloom use. But if you don't want, or can't, run Astra, then you can always try running a Burnice Vivian team with Lucy or Lytra in the 3rd slot. Or Piper Vivian Caesar, using Freedom Blues for the extra build-up. It also makes for really engaging instant rotations due to how fast these 2 characters can trigger Ablooms. But Burnice in particular gets even more benefits. Burnice's afterburn makes up a decent portion of her damage and anomaly build-up. Unfortunately, she's unable to proc this herself, which really pigeonholes her into being played off-field. Vivian's Prophecy though is a regular attack damage, and that comes from Vivian, not Burnice. So even when Burnice is the active character, her afterburn keeps proccing over and over without end. Yanagi also makes for a great teammate. If you have her on 2, she can proc Ablooms even more efficiently than Piper, to the point that even with Astra's quick assists, it becomes difficult to keep up with how fast feathers get spent. Time Weaver's Disorder bonus works too, as an additive bonus, meaning up to 37% more Corruption Disorder damage at P1. But even at just M0 and without signature, her Polarity Disorders benefit from Vivian's additional ability. With Shock being tied with Corruption for the highest disorder damage scaling, you can get some pretty ridiculous damage going by bouncing back and forth. And if you're the kind that plays with Thunder Metal, then Vivian slots well into the rotation, as you'd already be maximizing Shock uptime to begin with. When you factor in how Vivian's Prophecy also helps with triggering Shock damage 6, and something like a Yanagi Vivian trigger team can perform exceptionally well. This is something that Grace benefits from as well, except that Grace also helps increase Vivian's Abloom damage. Sure, Grace's additional ability only increases shock damage, not shock disorder damage, but Vivian's Ablooms are derived from the standard instances of shock damage, which means that they benefit from this too, making every single Abloom hit 36% harder than it normally would. Although Nicole does have Anti-Synergies with Vivian, her buffs are very strong, so despite all the issues, she's still a decent pick. This is even more apparent with Miyabi, who remains an incredibly strong pairing. But Vivian's best partner is without a doubt Jane. The high scaling on physical from Vivian's core passive is a bonus, as Ablooms would scale higher for physical than burn, shock, or corruption. That reasoning would also apply to Piper, but Jane offers a fair bit more than that. Remember how damage numbers also inherit the element of the anomaly it triggers from? That's because as far as the game is concerned, it is a damage tick off that anomaly. So every single Abloom damage instance in Ether is considered corruption damage, hence why it benefits from Vivian's additional ability. Every Abloom damage instance in Electro is considered shock damage, hence why it benefits from Grace's additional ability. And so it stands that every Abloom damage instance in Physical is considered assault damage. Jane's core passive gives any assault damage a chance to trigger a crit. Since Abloom is assault damage, that means all of Vivian's Ablooms in a Jane team will also benefit from this. Keep in mind that as Abloom is its own instance of assault, its crit status is independent from the original assault. This means Jane can crit her assault and Vivian's Ablooms won't, or vice versa, with no assault crit but Abloom does crit. It's not perfect. Jane can sometimes struggle with Vivian, as her EX isn't cheap, so it can be difficult to spend feathers fast enough. But add Astra to the team and that concern is gone. You do want to be proccing disorders, but physical disorder isn't particularly strong. So you can even get away with not caring and just having Jane hyper carry. Optimal play would still focus on it, but you can also just apply assault over and over and not suffer too much for it, so long as you're quickly triggering corruption disorder when it comes up. This way, you'd be having most of your Ablooms come as assault damage and benefit from the crit passive. And all of this scales with Jane's M2. With Abloom being considered assault damage, the Death Shred and crit damage increase from it both translate directly to Abloom. Unfortunately, Jane's M4 and M6 don't work. M4 is when any squad member triggers the assault or disorder effects. M6 is after any squad member inflicts assault, and any additional attack rides on that instance of assault, not deal assault damage. And this terminology really does matter, because it relates to how drive discs work too. To get this out of the way, no, Ablooms don't work with Fang Metal or Branch on Blade. The way they refer to things is important. It's the same terminology as Jane's M4 and M6. Branch on Blade is triggers the shatter effects, much like Jane's M4. Fang Metal is inflicts assault, much like Jane's M6. The specifics as to why gets very complicated. Enough material for an entirely different video, and this one is long enough. So let's park this for another day. The takeaway from this is, if you're taking too long to bounce back between disorders, Abloom isn't going to stop these buffs from falling off your carries. And you don't want to be running these sets on Vivian, as they do nothing for her. Only Anomaly proficiency and the original Anomaly damage value matters for Abloom. Even in an assault comp, physical damage will do nothing for Vivian. And since Anomalies can't crit, Branch on Blade's effects are worthless. There are other drive discs that Vivian's team may use that are worth paying attention to though. When it comes to Astral Voice, if you aren't running Astra, you can only give the buff to one of your 2 Anomaly units. In theory, this means that unless most of your blooms are happening in Corruption, you wouldn't want Vivian to have it. But because quick assists lead to the Noblewoman state, the extra woes that comes from it may make up for the slight damage loss. And even if none of your blooms land in Ether, it still contributes to Corruption Disorder damage scaling. On comps without quick assist though, like Burnice Vivian Lighter, or Piper Vivian Caesar, Freedom Blues can be a great pick. Protopunks works well in these comps too. You absolutely want to be using Vivian's defensive assist and assist follow-up whenever you can to supplement your feather generation. And given how most of your Anomaly and Abloom damage is landing out of stun, it's an incredibly competitive option. Vivian's own drive discs in comparison are incredibly simple. She has a set tailor-made for her, Phaethon's Melody, and it's really the only 4-piece you want to be running. Since you get its Anomaly proficiency bonus whenever any squad member uses an EX special, that means every single Abloom triggered by EXs is guaranteed to have its bonus. And Vivian has no inherent sources of ether damage percent, so it's easily her best in slot option. And if you recall, Featherbloom builds Anomaly. Since ether damage percent is increased, that means the majority of Vivian's Anomaly application also benefits from it. Just don't forget that although the Anomaly proficiency is from any squad member, the ether damage percent bonus is only for characters other than Vivian. The 2-piece sets are simple too. Since you want the most Anomaly proficiency possible, that means either Freedom Blues or Chaos Jazz. If you have particularly good substat rolls in other pieces though, like Chaotic Metal, Astro and Hormone, or even Puffer Electro, then they can work too. Vivian's main stat picks are pretty straightforward, although with some variance. D4 is Anomaly proficiency, D5 can be ether damage percent, attack percent, or pen percent, and D6 is Anomaly mastery, although you can technically run attack percent. Just to reiterate, anything that isn't Anomaly proficiency has no bearing on Abloom damage. Running off-element D5s do not contribute to Abloom damage. And the Featherbloom Anomaly buildup is always ether, even if the Abloom itself is sourced from a different element. But just because something doesn't buff Abloom damage by itself doesn't mean that it can't contribute to the damage that Abloom scales from. There will be some Ablooms that inevitably trigger on Corruption. And more Corruption damage also means more Corruption Disorder damage, yada yada, we've covered this already. With all things being equal, one Anomaly proficiency roll will be better than an attack percent roll. After all, Anomaly proficiency both increases Vivian's Anomaly damage and her Abloom scaling. But 2 attack percent rolls would, on average, be a greater benefit to Vivian than just one Anomaly proficiency roll. The more Anomaly proficiency you have on Vivian, the more diversified she'd become by investing on attack. It's still worse than going all in on Abloom, but it isn't all that bad. So if you aren't giving up your total substat count, always shoot for Anomaly proficiency. But if you are, then it's okay to sacrifice some points in it for attack percent instead. Anomaly proficiency D4 is a no-brainer. More Anomaly damage, more Disorder damage, and more Abloom damage. As for D5, Vivian has no inherent bonuses for any of its options, be it attack percent, damage percent, or pen percent. but depending on her comp and total substat rolls, the optimal stat varies. Pen% is the weakest of the lot, but if you're running her with Rena, like in a Yanagi Vivian Rena comp, it could be the best pick. It's the only instance where a non-anomaly proficiency 2-piece set, namely Puff Electro, becomes competitive. Attack% is good, but you can roll that on substats, which would saturate it slightly. If running her with an Astra or Caesar comp, the sheer amount of flat combat attack they give would saturate this even further. So ether damage % is usually the best option. This is saturated by Phaethon's Melody's 4-piece set effect though. Astra Voice and Astra do saturate this further, but less so than attack %, making it the best all-round choice for Vivian. Unless you have M6, but that's pretty steep. D6 should be Anomaly Mastery. I've mentioned time and time again that Vivian struggles with Anomaly buildup. Every Anomaly agent with the exception of Vivian has buildup increases. Burnice gets 65% for her EX and afterburns. Yanagi gets 45% on all basic attacks. Grace gets 135% for her specials and EXs. Jane gets up to 30% on all attacks. Miyabi gets 80% based off her crit rate. And even Piper can get up to 80% of her power stacks. This means that Vivian is the first ever Anomaly agent to be released without any Anomaly build-up bonuses. Not to mention other agents have even more build-up on their weapons. Anomaly Mastery does not inherently give any damage, but more anomalies in a run mean more disorders, which adds up to more damage overall. And before you ask, no, Energy Regen D6 is not good. It does help Vivian with generating more feathers, and can help build her some Anomaly by having more EXs. But the loss in general build-up from Anomaly Mastery, or even just the raw damage from an attack % D6 alternative, makes it far from optimal. Attack % is really good for damage, so in practice it may not be much worse, especially if you have good substat rolls, but the recommendation is certainly Anomaly Mastery. Unless you have Vivian's M2 and her signature Wenjin, then attack % becomes a better option, which segues nicely into her Wenjins. Flight of Fancy is unsurprisingly her best option. At level 60, P1 and with max stacks, you're getting 210 Anomaly proficiency from it alone. Conveniently, it needs the equipper to deal ether damage to build stacks, with the buff only lasting 5 seconds, but you can refresh it every 0.5 seconds. And how unsurprising it is that Vivian's Prophecy means that you have maximum stacks of this at all times. The most important part of this Wenjin though is the Anomaly build-up rate, being the only source of the stat for Vivian outside of M2 or Deadly Assault buffs. Technically you can get build-up rate from Sharp and Stinger, but that'd be a lot worse than just running an A-rank Wenjin. And surprisingly, her A-rank options are pretty decent. I'd refer you to other creators who break down the numbers in a way that I can't, but across the board the consensus is that Flight of Fancy is around 20% better than the other A-rank options. Considering characters like Evelyn had their signatures provide over 35% increases from A-rank alternatives, Vivian's free-to-play options don't seem so bad. Weeping Gemini provides a whopping 184 Anomaly proficiency bonus in addition to 25% attack. The only problem is, it's something you need to ramp up to and resets after the target recovers from stun. And before you ask, no, Ablooms don't count for building the stack. Much like with Drive Discs and Jane's Mindscapes, it inflicts an attribute anomaly, not deal attribute anomaly damage. The plus point is that since it's only when the target recovers from stun, you can go through a full burst rotation in the stun period and it will all benefit from its stacks. It does need to ramp up first though, which means it can struggle in Shiyu, especially as stacks are also cleared when enemies die, and you can't really pre-build it on the mob wave. But for the longer fights, like Tower or Deadly Assault, it performs very well. Although even there it may struggle if you're running a comp that can stun reasonably fast, like with Caesar or Trigger as a third slot. For these situations, Electro Lip Gloss can be quite decent. It only offers 75 Anomaly proficiency, coming from its main stat, but the 16% attack and 25% damage do help. Overall, Weeping Gemini is the safer bet, but I'd encourage experimenting with Electro Lip Gloss depending on the comp and encounter. Take Typhon for example. You actively avoid applying shock to him outside of stun or as a jump interrupt. He also stuns so fast that there just isn't enough time for Weeping Gemini to build. So don't hesitate to shift things around and see if it helps your scores. Bar Flight of Fancy, and none of the other Wenjins will be any better than these two. Yes, even Time Weaver. Its bug has been fixed. All things considered, many creators have recommended Vivian's M1 over her signature weapon. And if you are at M1, you might as well go for M2 before rolling for her Wenjin, as it's a significant increase. Vivian's Mindscapes are very high value. Like with Wenjins, I'd refer you to other creators who can give you a rundown of the numbers. In terms of playstyle though, a lot of them can change how you approach fights with Vivian. M1 is a straight increase to anomaly damage and disorder damage. Pretty good, but it gets an added bonus of regenerating a flight feather whenever 4 guard feathers are used. This can streamline some stun rotations, as you can get flight feathers at any time, even during suspension. Since it's when any 4 guard feathers are used, not 4 out of 5, you can offset the regen. M2 is arguably one of the strongest Mindscapes in the game. Ablooms now scale even more of anomaly proficiency, and it gets a passive 15% rest shred regardless of its parent anomaly. We care more about than just damage though, because a 25% ether anomaly buildup it provides is huge for Vivian. It may not be 40%, but it's enough that it isn't as awkward to make do without her Wenjin. If you do have her Wenjin as well as M2, then attack percent D6 becomes a viable option, or you can continue to run Anomaly Mastery to open up entirely new rotations. M4 is just damage, but it does have a nice quality of life by starting with a full stack of guard feathers, so no need to build or convert feathers in the opener. And M6? Well, that takes what we know about Vivian and flips it on its head. The ether damage percent bonus is so high that attack percent D5 is marginally better, and as with other Mindscapes, damage is damage. But Noblewoman Waltz's counter now generates an additional feather, meaning 3 flight feathers for a counter. This makes fishing for attacks skyrocket in value. And the extra feather on EX also means potential for optimization and stun combos, as now an EX cancel into Waltz maxes out her feathers. The big thing though is, instead of suspension just converting flight feathers to guard feathers, it first consumes all of your existing guard feathers to proc an immediate Abloom. This does mean that it's no longer possible to overcap. You spend all of your guard feathers before the flight feathers are converted. That's handy, but more importantly, the damage of the Abloom is multiplied by the number of guard feathers consumed. It's a direct increase. 1 guard feather used is just a standard Abloom, but 5 guard feathers leads to an Abloom that's 5 times stronger. Since you can now proc Ablooms without anomalies or EXs, Vivian's entire game plan changes. Instead of gaining benefit from characters that can quickly trigger Ablooms, you now want to not do that and save all guard feathers for your nukes. That's because now, characters like Nicole, who struggle in maintaining their debuffs from multiple Ablooms, only need to accommodate a single hit. And with that level of burst so readily accessible, Vivian can even be played as a solo damage unit that focuses on instant burst. Although, it's still true that the better her team is, the better Vivian performs. So if you're spending $2,000 for Vivian dupes, what's another $2,000 for Jane dupes? Rather than looking to get character dupes though, you might actually want to get Bangboo dupes. There's been very little discourse on Bangboos, but with Robin pioneering one character additional abilities, they're now more important than ever. Bangboos are actually pretty strong, but they're especially strong for anomaly agents. When Bangboos perform their active skill, they'll do some damage, and that damage can be quite significant. They build days too, which adds up over the course of a long fight, and can help you meet stun thresholds. But what matters more than the damage or the days is the anomaly application bonus that they provide. We've covered how the damage from anomalies averaged. 50% of the gauge with buffs, then 50% without, means you get something in the middle. But if you do half of the gauge of Bangboo and half of an agent, the anomaly damage is considered to be 100% that of the agent. The Bangboo does not dilute your anomaly damage. For a character like Vivian, this assistance can really help with building up ether. Rezona Boo builds a decent amount of anomaly with his attacks, which happens every 28 seconds. But Robin is almost 3 times the anomaly. And not only do you not need to keep an enemy inside an area of effect to get the full value, he attacks every 26 seconds instead. Since his additional ability only needs 1 Mockingbird member, Vivian alone is enough to activate it. So unless you happen to be on a non-anomaly agent when Robin does his thing, you're guaranteed to get a ridiculous amount of anomaly buildup. This is also in part why Snap just isn't that good. His damage percent bonus is nice, but he has no damaging active skill. In fact, he won't ever buff your agents unless you're getting a dodge counter, quick assist, or assist follow-up, meaning he'll just stand there loading film and doing nothing. And even if he does have film, you get no damage, days, or anomaly buildup. Even for attacker agents, that usually means fewer decibels. Don't let me oversell Bangboos to you though. They can get interrupted by enemy attacks, or just outright miss. They won't be fundamentally changing your core rotations, but they do absolutely help. Overall, Vivian is an incredibly simple character to play. Swap cancel out of her moves early, learn to manage flight and guard feathers by adapting to the fight, and have a good understanding of how Anomaly works. That last bit really is the most important point though. The reason this guide got this long is because it's as much an Anomaly guide as it is a Vivian guide. Learning how Vivian's invulnerability works is a big deal if you're shooting for Demon Lord medals in Tower. Figuring out how to use special shortcuts in your rotations can help make do without Signature or Mindscapes. And having a good understanding of finishes and the Bloom mechanics is critical to get the most out of Vivian teams. All this goes to show is that at the core of every guide is just building on an understanding of how the game works. So if you're interested in more niche tech videos, technical character guides, or detailed breakdown of this game's inner workings, then do like, share, subscribe, and ring the bell. I've got more videos coming. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you next time.